The infantry is the branch of a military force that fights on foot, as the troops who are intended to engage, fight, and defeat the enemy in face-to-face combat. They bear the brunt of warfare and typically suffer the greatest number of casualties. Historically, as the oldest branch of the combat arms, the infantry are the tip of the spear of a modern army, and continually undergo training that is more physically stressful and psychologically demanding than that of any other branch of the combat arms. Infantry can enter and maneuver in terrain that is inaccessible to military vehicles and employ crew-served infantry weapons that provide greater and more sustained firepower. The transport and delivery techniques of modern infantrymen to engage in battle include marching, mechanized transport, airborne by parachute or by air assault from helicopter, and amphibious landing from the sea. History and etymology. In English, the 16th century term infantry describes soldiers who walk to the battlefield, and there engage, fight, and defeat the enemy in direct combat, usually to take and occupy the terrain. As describing the branch of the combat arms, the term infantry derives from the French infantry, which, in turn, is derived from the Italian fanteria and ultimately from the Latin infantera. The individual soldier term infantryman was not coined until the 19th century. Historically, before the invention and the introduction of firearms to warfare, the foot soldiers of previous eras, armed with blunt and edged weapons, and a shield, also are considered and identified as infantrymen. The term arose in 16th century Spain, which boasted the first professional standing army seen in Europe since the days of Rome. It was common to appoint royal princes to military commands, and the men under them became known as infanteria. In the Western world, during the Greco-Roman antiquity, and during the Middle Ages, infantry soldiers were categorized, characterized, and identified according to the type of weapons and armor with which they were armed, thus heavy infantry and light infantry. Since the application of firearms to warfare, the classifications of infantrymen have changed to reflect their formations on the battlefield, such as line infantry, and to reflect the modes of transporting them to the battlefield, and the tactics deployed by specific types of combat units, such as mechanized infantry and airborne infantry. Combat role. As a branch of the armed forces, the role of the infantry in warfare is to engage, fight, and kill the enemy at close range, using either a firearm, an edged weapon, or bare hands, as required by the mission to hand. Thus in the Australian Army and New Zealand Army, the role of the infantry is to seek out and close with the enemy, to kill or capture him, to seize and hold ground, to repel attack, by day or night, regardless of season, weather or terrain. In the Canadian Army, the role of the infantry is to close with and destroy the enemy. In the U.S. Army, the infantry closes with the enemy, by means of fire and maneuver, in order to destroy or capture him, or to repel his assault by fire, close combat, and counterattack. In the U.S. Marine Corps, the role of the infantry is to locate, close with, and destroy the enemy with fire and maneuver, and to repel the enemy assault by fire in close combat. Beginning with the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, artillery has become an increasingly dominant force on the battlefield. Since World War I, combat aircraft and armored vehicles have also become dominant. However, the most effective method for locating all enemy forces on a battlefield is still the infantry patrol, and it is the presence or absence of infantry that ultimately determines whether a particular piece of ground has been captured or held. In 20th and 21st century warfare, infantry functions most effectively as part of a combined arms team including artillery, armor, and combat aircraft. Studies have shown that of all casualties, 50% or more were caused by artillery, about 10% were caused by machine guns, 2 to 5% by rifle fire, and 1% or less by hand grenades, bayonets, knives, and unarmed combat combined. Several infantry divisions, both Allied and Axis, in the European theatre of World War II suffered higher than 100% combat and non-combat casualties, and some above 200%, meaning that the number of service personnel that became casualties was greater than the sum of the division's available service positions at full strength. Organization. Infantry relies on organized formations to be employed in battle. These have evolved over time, but remain a key element to effective infantry development and deployment. Until the end of the 19th century, infantry units were for the most part employed in close formations up until contact with the enemy. This allowed commanders to retain control of the unit, especially while maneuvering, as well as allowing officers to retain discipline amongst the ranks. The development of machine guns and other weapons with increased firepower forced infantry units to disperse in order to make them less vulnerable to such weapons. This decentralization of command was made possible by improved communications equipment and greater focus on small unit training. From World War I, it was recognized that infantry were best employed when using their ability to maneuver in constricted terrain, and evade detection in ways not possible for other weapons such as vehicles. Among the various subtypes of infantry is medium infantry. This refers to infantry which are less heavily armed and armored than heavy infantry, but more so than light infantry. In the early modern period, medium infantry were largely eliminated due to discontinued use of body armor up until the 20th century. In the United States Army, striker infantry is considered medium infantry, since they are heavier than light infantry but lighter than mechanized infantry. Doctrine. Infantry doctrine is the concise expression of how infantry forces contribute to campaigns, major operations, battles, and engagements. It is a guide to action, not a set of hard and fast rules. Doctrine provides a very common frame of reference across the military forces, allowing the infantry to function cooperatively in what are now called combined arms operations. Doctrine helps standardize operations, facilitating readiness by establishing common ways of accomplishing infantry tasks. Doctrine links theory, history, experimentation, and practice. Its objective is to foster initiative and creative thinking in the infantry's tactical combat environment. Doctrine provides the infantry with an authoritative body of statements on how infantry forces conduct operations and provides a common lexicon for use by infantry planners and leaders. Until the development of effective artillery doctrines, and more recently precision-guided air-delivered ordnance, the most recent important role of the infantry has been as the primary force of inflicting casualties on the enemy through aimed fire. The infantry is also the only combat arm which can ultimately decide whether any given tactical position is occupied, and it is the presence of infantry that assures control of terrain. While the tactics of employment in battle have changed, the basic missions of the infantry have not. Retractions to the infantry concept. Although it has been argued that infantrymen and infantry tactics are an antiquated and careless use of military manpower and resources, the infantryman has proven quite capable against many units, some much more sophisticated. For instance, light infantry has proven to be effective against tank units by exploiting a tank's limited field of fire and view when using grenades or anti-tank rockets. Air bombardment that otherwise have flattened cities and may be ineffective against a dug-in infantry force, such as at the Battle of Stalingrad 1942–1943. Operations. Attack operations. Attack operations are the most basic role of the infantry, and along with defense, form the main stances of the infantry on the battlefield. Traditionally, in an open battle, or meeting engagement, two armies would maneuver to contact, at which point they would form up their infantry and other units opposite each other. Then one or both would advance and attempt to defeat the enemy force. The goal of an attack remains the same. to advance into an enemy-held objective, most frequently a hill, river crossing, city or other dominant terrain feature, and dislodge the enemy, thereby establishing control of the objective. Attacks are often feared by the infantry conducting them because of the high number of casualties suffered while advancing to close with and destroy the enemy while under enemy fire. In mechanized infantry, the armored personnel carrier is considered the assaulting position. These APCs can deliver infantrymen through the front lines to the battle in the case of infantry fighting vehicles, contribute supporting firepower to engage the enemy. Successful attacks rely on sufficient force, preparative reconnaissance and battlefield preparation with bomb assets. Retention of discipline and cohesion throughout the attack is paramount to success. A subcategory of attacks is the ambush, where infantrymen lie in wait for enemy forces before attacking at a vulnerable moment. This gives the ambushing infantryman the combat advantage of surprise, concealment and superior firing positions, and causes confusion. The ambush unit does not know what it is up against, or where they are attacking from. Patrol operations. Patrolling is the most common infantry mission. Full-scale attacks and defensive efforts are occasional, but patrols are constant. Patrols consist of small groups of infantry moving about in areas of possible enemy activity to locate the enemy and destroy them when found. Patrols are used not only on the front lines, but in rear areas where enemy infiltration or insurgencies are possible. Pursuit operations. Pursuit is a role that the infantry often assumes. The objective of pursuit operations is the destruction of withdrawing enemy forces which are not capable of effectively engaging friendly units before they can build their strength to the point where they are effective. Infantry traditionally have been the main force to overrun these units in the past, and in modern combat are used to pursue enemy forces in constricted terrain, where faster forces, such as armored vehicles, are incapable of going or would be exposed to ambush. Defense operations. Defense operations are the natural counter to attacks, in which the mission is to hold an objective and defeat enemy forces attempting to dislodge the defender. Defensive posture offers many advantages to the infantry, including the ability to use terrain and constructed fortifications to advantage. These reduce exposure to enemy fire compared with advancing forces. Effective defense relies on minimizing losses to enemy fire, breaking the enemy's cohesion before their advance is completed, and preventing enemy penetration of defensive positions. Escort operations. Escorting consists of protecting support units from ambush, particularly from hostile infantry forces. Combat support units are not as well armed or trained as infantry units and have a different mission. Therefore, they need the protection of the infantry, particularly when on the move. This is one of the most important roles for the modern infantry, particularly when operating alongside armored vehicles. In this capacity, infantry essentially conducts patrol on the move, scouring terrain which may hide enemy infantry waiting to ambush friendly vehicles, and identifying enemy strong points for attack by the heavier units. Base defense. Infantry units are tasked to protect certain areas like command posts or air bases. Units assigned to this job usually have a large number of military police attached to them for control of checkpoints and prisons. Maneuvering operations. Maneuvering consumes much of an infantry unit's time. Infantry, like all combat arms units, are often maneuvered to meet battlefield needs, and often must do so under enemy attack. The infantry must maintain the cohesion and readiness during the move to ensure their usefulness when they reach their objective. Traditionally, infantry have relied on their own legs for mobility, but mechanized or armored infantry often uses trucks and armored vehicles for transport. These units can quickly disembark and transition to light infantry, without vehicles, to access terrain which armored vehicles can't effectively access. Reconnaissance, intelligence gathering. Surveillance operations are often carried out with the employment of small recon units or sniper teams which gather information about the enemy. reporting on characteristics such as size, activity, location, unit and equipment. These infantry units typically are known for their stealth and ability to operate for periods of time within close proximity of the enemy without being detected. They may engage high-profile targets, or be employed to hunt down terrorist cells and insurgents within a given area. These units may also entice the enemy to engage a located recon unit, thus disclosing their location to be destroyed by more powerful friendly forces. Military reserve force. Some assignments for infantry units involve deployment behind the front, although patrol and security operations are usually maintained in case of enemy infiltration. This is usually the best time for infantry units to integrate replacements into units and to maintain equipment. Additionally, soldiers can be rested and general readiness should improve. However, the unit must be ready for deployment at any point. Construction, engineering. This can be undertaken either in reserve or on the front, but consists of using infantry troops as labor for construction of field positions, roads, bridges, airfields, and all other manner of structures. The infantry is often given this assignment because of the physical quantity of strong men within the unit, although it can lessen a unit's morale and limit the unit's ability to maintain readiness and perform other missions. More often, such jobs are given to specialist engineering corps. Raids. Hostage rescue. Infantry units are trained to quickly mobilize, infiltrate, enter and neutralize threat forces when appropriate combat intelligence indicates to secure a location, a rescue or capture high-profile targets. Urban combat. Urban combat poses unique challenges to the combat forces. It is one of the most complicated type of operations an infantry unit will undertake, with many places for the enemy to hide and ambush from. Infantry units must be trained in how to enter a city, and systematically clear the buildings, which most likely will be booby-trapped, in order to kill or capture enemy personnel within the city. Care must be taken to differentiate innocent civilians who often hide and support the enemy from the non-uniformed armed enemy forces. Civilian and military casualties both are usually very high. Day-to-day service. Because of an infantryman's duties with firearms, explosives, physical and emotional stress, physical violence, casualties and deaths are not uncommon in both war and in peacetime training or operations. It is a highly dangerous and demanding combat service, and in World War II military doctors concluded that even physically unwounded soldiers were psychologically worn out after about 200 days of combat. The physical, mental and environmental operating demands of the infantrymen are high. All of the combat necessities such as ammunition, weapon systems, food, water, clothing and shelter are carried on the backs of the infantrymen, at least in light role as opposed to mounted, mechanized. Combat loads of over 36 kilograms are standard, and greater loads in excess of 45 kilograms are very common. These heavy loads, combined with long foot patrols of over 40 kilometers a day, in any climate from 43 to minus 29 degrees Celsius in temperature, require the infantrymen to be in good physical and mental shape. Infantrymen live, fight and die outdoors in all types of brutal climates, often with no physical shelter. Poor climate conditions adds misery to this already demanding existence. Disease epidemics, frostbite, heat stroke, trench foot, insect and wild animal bites are common along with stress disorders, and these have sometimes caused more casualties than enemy action. Despite the hardships, infantrymen are expected to continue with their combat missions despite death and injury of friends, fear, despair, fatigue and bodily injury. Some infantry units are considered special forces. The earliest Special Forces Commando units were more highly trained infantrymen, with special weapons, equipment and missions. Special Forces units recruit heavily from regular infantry units to fill their ranks. Foreign and domestic militaries typically have a slang term for their infantrymen. In the U.S. military, the slang term among both Marine and Army infantrymen for themselves is grunt. In the British Army, they're the squaddies. The infantry is a small, close-knit community, and the slang names are terms of endearment that convey mutual respect and shared experiences.